The mother of my grandfather Henry McMullen was Catherine Brady, who was the eldest daughter of a large family living in Hartley, west of the Blue Mountains. Unlike the other branches of my family, this staunchly Irish Catholic branch produced 7 nuns, a missionary brother, and an archbishop over 3 generations. A study of their lives provides a very different perspective on the working lives of women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Usually working in harsh and difficult conditions, many of these women died at a relatively early age. Their experiences also provide insights into the social history of the time. Catherine's parents, Hugh and Bridget Brady, were both born and married in the small town of Clune, in the south of County Leitrim, one of Ireland's smallest counties in the middle of the island. They grew up during the 1820s and 30s, a period of rapid population growth that put pressure on the small farms that Catholics were able to work on. Hugh and Bridget left Ireland on board the Moffat for Australia as assisted immigrants, probably due to population and land pressures in their rural area, and shortly before the tragic potato famine. On their arrival in Sydney in 1841, having been at sea for 3 months, Hugh and Bridget almost immediately travelled by bullock dray across the Blue Mountains to Little Hartley at the foot of Mount Victoria. Here they settled into farming, raising a family of 10 children over the next almost 50 years. Bridget had her 10th and last child in 1861, completing a childbearing period of 20 years. 2 died young, and a further one in a head-on train collision. Of the 8 surviving Brady children, 6 had children or grandchildren who were nuns or religious or who were linked by family in some way. The lives of these nuns vary widely, some living to old age, but more often dying young due to illness and physical hardships. A couple became leaders in their orders, while others lived simpler lives, sometimes being not much more than servants. The first of the nuns was Bridget, 8th child of the Brady family, who entered the Sisters of Mercy convent in Bathurst in 1881 and took the name Sister Matthew. After 2 years of training, she was sent with 5 other young nuns, all in their 20s, to start a new school at Cobar, 500 kilometres northwest of Bathurst. Cobar was a copper mining town barely 10 years old in the 1880s. It was experiencing a rapid population increase, but living conditions there were very primitive. Dwellings in the town were makeshift because of the difficulty of obtaining building materials. Transport in those times was slow and difficult. Sister Matthew and her companions travelled by train to the terminus of the Western Railway line at Nyngan, and then the last 130 kilometres by Cobb & Co coach. They arrived in the 40-degree heat of February, and they settled into the presbytery, which had been vacated by the parish priest to provide for their accommodation. In Cobar, the sisters set up a primary and infant school where those students whose families could afford to pay weekly fees did so, while poorer students were admitted free. The sisters also opened a superior school for the early secondaries, where they provided, in their words,
a thorough English education, a sound knowledge of the French language, and special attention to arithmetic.
The sisters also offered music to students not attending the convent school on a private fee basis as a way of making extra income. Funding was very tight for the sisters, but was supplemented by fetes, concerts, and by private donations. An additional part of the sisters' work was visiting the poor, the sick, and the bereaved. After the school day, the black-robed sisters would travel in pairs to various dwellings, providing material support to those in need at the time when there was no government-provided social welfare system. The sisters lived very full and busy days. Sister Matthew, now 25, was in charge of the primary school at Cobar, while at the same time teaching 3 classes. She went on to be superior of various convents in Western New South Wales, including Cobar, Burke, Brewarrina and Parkes, covering an area larger than that of Tasmania. In later years, when she was in her 40s, she also served as novice mistress, assistant to the Mother General of the Order in the Western area, and bursar in charge of finances. By this time, she had become Mother Matthew. She died in 1943 at the age of 90, by which time 4 of her nieces had followed her into the convent. Her life is an example of the challenging and rigorous work carried out by these nun pioneers. The life of her niece, Sister Gabriel, exemplifies the physical sufferings and privations of these early nuns. Angela Brady was the daughter of Sister Matthew's elder brother Frank, who lived at Murrumburra, near Harden, close to Yass. Angela attended the Sisters of Mercy boarding school in Yass. At the age of 19, she entered Mercy Sisters Convent in Burke, 600 kilometres from her home, though close to where her aunt, Sister Matthew, was teaching. Here, Angela took the name of Sister Gabriel. The Mercy Sisters had been at Burke since 1891. It was a busy depot and port for the remote grazing properties of the far west, and despite the wealth in the town, there were many poor. The nuns set up a primary and infant school, and in addition they visited the poor and the sick in their homes, the hospitals, the inmates in jail and the Aboriginal families there. The climate was very severe, especially during the summer, and the nuns often lived in very primitive conditions, with poor or inadequate food. During this time, many young Irish women joined the Mercies, coming out to work in towns like Burke and Brewarrina, where they found it extremely difficult to cope with the extreme heat and physical deprivations. Large numbers of them died young, as did those women who came from surrounding New South Wales. The main killer was tuberculosis. In 1911, Sister Gabriel was sent to teach in Brewarrina, 100 kilometres away from Burke, where Sister Matthew was on the staff. The Mercy Sisters had set up a convent and primary school there in 1894. Their convent was a 3-room house with a dining room and kitchen in the old jail building next door. The conditions under which the nuns lived would have been every bit as primitive as those endured by those in Burke. Within a few years, the young Sister Gabriel herself contracted tuberculosis. In the years just prior to this, young Mercy sisters in this area were continuing to die of tuberculosis in significant numbers. Some lived for up to 5 years with the disease before they died, while others died within 6 months of contracting the illness. Their sickness put pressure on the other members of their convents, both in the extra workloads placed on the others in terms of teaching and housework, but also in the psychological and physical pressures of living with people with infectious diseases, even though the affected sisters ate and slept separately from the rest of the community. In 1912, the Mercy Sisters found a place in Blackheath that had a more congenial climate that would serve as both an annual resting place for the sisters and also a sanatorium for those with tuberculosis. 6 sisters were able to come there in the hope of recovery or to live with their final years in less extreme conditions. It was here that Sister Gabriel came to from Brewarrina early in 1917. Her 70-year-old mother, Kate, nursed her daughter for the next 7 months until she died in August, aged just 30. Agnes Latham, another niece of Sister Matthew, became a nun, but instead of joining the Mercy Sisters, she joined the Good Samaritan Sisters. Agnes, the daughter of Mary Brady, grew up on an isolated cattle station near Charters Towers in northern Queensland. About 8 years earlier, Agnes's parents had moved to Charters Towers, which was 2,000 kilometres north of Hartley Vale. At the age of 18, Agnes travelled south again, 5 hours by train to Townsville and then a number of days by boat to Sydney. There she entered the novitiate at St Scholastica's convent Glebe to train as a Good Samaritan sister. The Good Samaritans had originally been set up to care for disadvantaged and abused women at a time when there was no government support for such people. However, it was not long before they became very involved in teaching, and Agnes, now Sister Aloysia, was soon teaching students from poor families in inner-city primary schools. In these years just before World War I, Sister Aloysia taught at Rozelle, Newtown and Forest Lodge, then mainly areas of poverty. In 1905, a Sydney Council report made the following comment on these areas.
For more than 1/4 of a century, the same squalor and wretchedness, the same misery of poverty, the same crowd of ill-clad and ill-fed children playing hide and seek in foul corners has to be seen.
The incidence of typhoid in this area was 6 times the average for Sydney as a whole. These were the conditions under which Sister Aloysia worked, her obituary later noting that she was of a bright and loving disposition and made many friends. In 1915, when she was 32 years old, her health was failing, and she was sent back to northern Queensland to teach at a school near Ayr, not far from her parents' cattle station. She continued teaching there for another 5 years, but died aged 37, her life doubtless shortened by the hard work of her teaching life. Catherine Wish, another niece of Mother Matthew, also became a member of the Good Samaritans and, unlike her cousins, lived a very long life. She seems to have been a highly articulate, intelligent and capable woman, reminding me of her aunt, Sister Matthew. She was the daughter of Annie Wish, another younger sister of my great-grandmother, Catherine Brady. Catherine Wish's grandfather had been a convict and one of the pioneer settlers of Penrith, where he worked as a blacksmith. His son, Peter Wish, married Annie Brady, and Catherine was the youngest in the large family. By the time she was 9, the family had moved into the inner city to live in Camperdown, to be close to medical care for Catherine's sick elderly brother. Her father, Peter, was a tram driver, and the family always struggled to make ends meet. Catherine attended St James School, run by the Good Samaritan Sisters. One of her teachers, Sister Hilda, remembered Catherine Wish as an outstanding and outspoken student whose views often differed from those of her teachers, a characteristic that she retained throughout her long life. In 1912, at the age of 17, Catherine entered the Good Samaritan Order, the same one that her Queensland cousin, Sister Aloysia, had joined 12 years earlier. Taking the name of Sister Aquino, she went to St Bridget's Primary School at Marrickville, where she taught for the next 4 years. During these years, she was part of a community where many of the students' fathers were away from home as they fought in World War I. She would have seen the divisions in this community caused by the controversial plebiscites held over compulsory conscription, in which Catholics generally opposed conscription and were strongly criticised as being traitors to the British Empire for taking this position. In the 1920s, Sister Aquino moved north to teach in 4 Queensland schools. During the 1930s depression, she came back to teach in Sydney and New South Wales country schools, teaching in both primary and secondary. She was described by her community members as
always generous and kind. Her innate sense of humour provided many a cheerful recreation time. She was a good cook and dressmaker. She could spin a good yarn and had a wealth of stories to draw on from years of life experience.
In 1942, she was made superior of a special school, St Magdalene's Retreat, for delinquent and orphan girls in Arncliffe. This school ran a laundry to fund itself. It has since been closed down, and there are multi-storey apartment blocks at Walleye Creek where the school once stood. In the 1950s and 60s, Sister Aquino, now in her last decades of teaching, was principal at a number of schools around New South Wales, frequently representing her communities at major decision-making events. In her 70s, she reverted to part-time teaching before spending her final years confined to a wheelchair at the Mother House dying in 1990, aged 95. In her life, Sister Aquino exemplified the intelligent, resourceful and hard-working kind of nun who taught in all sorts of conditions and ably led the schools through the most difficult of times. In this, she resembled her aunt Sister Matthew for later generations of nuns and students. Sister Aquino had a cousin, Mary Murray, who was the last of the Brady family nuns. Mary's father was a wool classer by occupation who moved into hotel keeping. He held the licences for several hotels in Helensburgh, Picton, Thirlmere and East Maitland before taking over the Orient Hotel in Carrington at Newcastle. So Mary spent her early life in pubs. In 1911, aged 18, Mary joined the Mercy Sisters. This was at the same time as her relatives, Sisters Matthew and Gabriel, were teaching out at Brewarrina just prior to World War I. Mary, who became Sister Bernadette, was a skilled musician who went on to teach piano and singing activities at various Mercy schools, including Stanmore, Golden Grove, Eastwood, Byronier, Bondi Beach and Holy Cross Wallara, at the last of which she taught for a long time. One of her peers said of her,
"She was very talented, not only with piano, but artistic as well, talented with sketching and needlework. Physically, she was a beautiful looking woman. Contentment radiated from her. She had a lame foot and wore a heavy high boot, but this did not deter her works of mercy."
While teaching in these schools, Sister Bernadette had her share of family tragedies. Her mother died one night in an early car accident, walking home from benediction when she was struck down by a car driven by George Thompson, a heavyweight champion boxer, on a poorly lit section of Maitland Road in Newcastle. 3 years later, Sister Bernadette's younger brother died of tuberculosis at Waterfall Sanatorium south of Heathcote, leaving behind a young wife and 3 children. Sister Bernadette Murray died aged 71 in 1964, in my last year of high school. I wonder if she ever heard the Beatles. I'd like to think that she did, and that she liked their music, especially perhaps Paul McCartney's ballads. I also like to think that she had regular contact with her cousin, Sister Aquino. The Brady family did not only produce nuns. It also produced, via Sarah Brady, the youngest sister of my great-grandmother Catherine Brady, a missionary lay brother and an archbishop. In 1893, Sarah Brady married Richard Tweedy, a Geordie from the Newcastle area in England. Richard, the son of an engine driver, had emigrated as a 19-year-old and settled in Bellambi, Wollongong, where he entered the engineering department of the Bulli Coal Mining Company and began a young family there. The eldest son, George, joined the missionaries of the Sacred Heart, living almost all of his life in New Guinea. He chose to be a lay brother rather than a priest. Lay brothers, such as Brother George, provided the muscle and the technical know-how to make it possible for the MSC priests to visit the remote missions of New Guinea. In 1919, aged 25, Brother George went to Yule Island, 100 kilometres west of Port Moresby, and he stayed there till his death in 1968 when he was 74 years old. Lay brothers carried out works such as blasting rocks and building roads, pit sawing and constructing houses, breaking in horses, and rowing boats to reach the far-flung mission stations. In the wet seasons, the roads to the missions and the mission buildings themselves were often flooded, with boats providing the only connections. In his diary, Brother George recalls doing much of his work in waist-high water. He also recalls doing much repair work, building chimneys, repairing kitchen utensils, patching water tanks, and repairing bicycles. Conditions were very primitive, and he often had to walk all day to get from one mission to another. Nevertheless, Brother George seemed to love his life there and strongly resisted any attempts to bring him back to Australia. Brother George died in New Guinea in 1968, aged 74, 5 years before New Guinea gained its independence from Australia. His obituary states,
"In his 70s, he was an indomitable old bushman, a striking spectacle wherever he appeared, with his long, flowing white beard and the inevitable 2 feet bamboo pipe, artistically designed, that belched forth volumes of smoke. Though a spiritual man, he possessed a very colourful tongue, very earthy in his turn of phrase.
He is the only lay brother that I have come across in my family history. He seemed to revel in living in a very different and unsophisticated world, always helping others in a practical kind of way and strongly resisting any forced return to Australia. In all of these respects, he was a very different character from his younger brother, Ernest. Brother George's younger brother, Ernest, followed a distinguished clerical career. 7 years younger than George, Ernest received his education from the Sisters of St. Joseph at Bulli. He then worked for the Postmaster General's Department, serving at Bulli, Thurul, Singleton and Currambong before entering the seminary at St. Columbia's Springwood in 1919. Clearly, he was seen as one of the more promising students, as he was selected as one of the small number of students to go to Rome to complete their studies. He gained a doctorate in theology and was ordained in Rome on the 10th of December 1925. He returned to work in the Maitland Diocese in 1926, aged 25, and he served as assistant priest in the parish of Merriweather till 1931. Almost immediately, though, Ernest was given more senior duties, taking on the role of examiner of Christian doctrine in the secondary schools of the diocese, a position he held for 7 years. In 1931, in a series of promotions, Dr. Tweedy was transferred to the parish of Maitland, where he became diocesan secretary and later private secretary to the Bishop of Maitland. During the 1930s, Dr. Tweedy continued his rise in the Diocese of Maitland. In 1938, he was responsible for organising the Missionary and Eucharistic Congress at Newcastle, where he showed great energy and organisational skills. In 1942, Dr. Tweedy was appointed by Pius XII as Archbishop of Hobart. At that time, he was the youngest Archbishop in Australia. A few months later, he moved to Hobart and began a 12-year tenure there before retiring in 1955 with ill health. The years when Tweedy was Archbishop of Hobart spanned the post-war developments in Australia, and though this development was probably not as extensive as that of the mainland, Tweedy oversaw much building of new churches, schools and hospitals. He also did much to encourage and accommodate the large influx of migrants arriving in Tasmania at this time, particularly in terms of building schools. In 1954, Archbishop Tweedy's health deteriorated, and after 18 months of severe illness and major surgery, he resigned the See of Hobart in September 1955. He moved to Melbourne, where he lived for 10 further years in semi-retirement. During those years, he frequently assisted Archbishop Mannix, assisting at various Catholic functions. In 1965, he died from a severe heart attack. His obituary stated,
"In Tasmania, he won the affection of the clergy, of the religious, and of the people. Aloofness was foreign to him. Easy to approach, friendly and kind to all, he had the sympathy for the troubled, encouragement for those with difficulty, prudent advice and sound guidance for anyone who sought his counsel."
His brother George was still working in New Guinea at this time and returned for the funeral on one of his very rare visits to Australia. Also still working was the redoubtable Sister Aquino, now 60 and winding down to do part-time teaching. Finally, two relatives of the Brady family who lived and died earlier than the 5 Brady nuns already described provide a very different insight into the lives of nuns in the 19th century. These were Mary and Priscilla Garn, the elder sisters of Bridget Garn, who had married Patrick Brady. Mary, Priscilla and Bridget were all part of a family of 13 children living in Woonona, north of Wollongong. Their father, Michael Garn, was an Irish ex-convict who had been sentenced to 7 years transportation in New South Wales for stealing 3 pigs. A year after her father died, Mary Garn, one of the younger members of her family, but now 28, left Woonona to join a newly arrived French order of nuns, the Sacred Heart Sisters, at Rose Bay Convent, later to become Kincoppal. Unlike the Brady nuns, Mary did not become a teaching sister, but rather a coadjutrix, that is, a nun whose role was to do the housework, cooking and laundry for the other nuns and for the students at the boarding school. 2 years later, Mary's sister Priscilla joined her there to do the same kind of work as her sister. Why these two women, in their late 20s, should make this decision is puzzling. In 1888, Sister Mary was moved to the Convent of the Sacred Heart, Sacre-Cœur, in Glen Iris, Melbourne, which had just been established. Here she was in charge of the laundry and worked in the community living room. The work was probably demanding and exhausting, and she became ill in 1892, passing away the following year at the age of 39. Two years later, in 1890, Sister Priscilla Garn was sent from Rose Bay to work at the convent of the Sacred Heart at Timaru in New Zealand. Timaru is a port city on the South Island about midway between Christchurch and Dundee. Originating as a whaling station, Timaru was a bustling and prosperous town when the Sacred Heart Sisters set up another boarding school for girls there. The large two-storey building quickly became a landmark of Timaru. When Sister Priscilla arrived 10 years after the foundation of the boarding school, there would have been plenty of housework required to look after the boarders. Sister Priscilla was in charge of the baths and assistant porter and involved in other household duties. Like her sister Mary, Priscilla died relatively young in 1903, aged 46. Was the heavy manual work the cause of these sisters' early deaths? Their 8 family sisters all lived on into their 70s, so the early deaths of Mary and Priscilla are unusual. What was the motivation for these Brady and Garn women to join these orders of nuns? The traditional answer would be that they wanted to give their lives to God. Certainly, the choices were idealistic ones, aimed at doing good in the world and making a difference to the lives of those less fortunate despite the hardship involved, rather like working for Oxfam or international relief organisations these days. Perhaps there was also appeal for them in leading more activist and independent lives than would have been possible in a marriage, where they would likely have had many children. Nuns like Sisters Matthew and Aquino were leaders in their orders, managing very major responsibilities. The other teaching nuns travelled around different parts of the country, experiencing more of it than their married sisters would have. None of them, however, had the independence that males like George and Ernest Tweedy did. The ones that puzzle me most are the Garn sisters, Mary and Priscilla. They had roles where they were basically overworked servants, and both seem to have died relatively early from exhaustion. Was this better than living as a wife or single woman in Wollongong? Perhaps they saw their decisions more in terms of spiritual dedication. Whatever their motivations, these women lived lives of dedication, generosity and hard work, showing an interesting alternative to the more family-based lives of most women of these times. I admire these hard-working people and am proud to be related to them.